On June 23, 1944, German commanders in Belarus settled into their evening routines with absolute certainty. They went to bed confident. Not cautious. Not prudent. Confident. In their minds, the Eastern Front was secure, locked in place by massive fortifications, experienced troops, and 3 years of successful defense. They had held this ground since 1941, and they believed they would hold it for months to come. By breakfast the next morning, their entire world had changed. But history has been remarkably cruel to this moment. While every schoolchild learns about D-Day speeches and the Normandy landings happening just weeks prior, something exponentially larger transpired in the forests and plains of Belarus. While the Western world obsesses over Operation Overlord, they have somehow forgotten something bigger. Something that would reshape the entire European war in just 3 weeks. The moment when 2.4 million Soviet soldiers made 500,000 Germans simply disappear. This isn't simply another World War II battle to be catalogued and filed away. This is the story of how the Red Army pulled off the greatest magic trick in military history. Not through luck. Not through brute force alone. But through deception so masterful, so comprehensive, that an entire German army group was rendered blind, deaf, and dumb while facing total annihilation. By June 1944, the German Army Group Center held Belarus like a massive fist, punching deep into Soviet territory. The Germans called it the Belarusian Balcony, a salient that threatened Moscow itself. Hitler had transformed entire cities into fortresses: Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Boysk. Each designated as a Festung, a fortress that must never fall, never retreat, never surrender. These weren't suggestions. These were absolute orders backed by Hitler's authority and enforced through fear. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded these formidable forces. 500,000 combat troops under his direct authority. Another 300,000 support personnel. Together they controlled the main highway to Moscow. They'd held this territory continuously for 3 years, and they believed their position was virtually impregnable. German intelligence was absolutely certain about one critical thing. The next major Soviet attack would come in Ukraine, not Belarus. Their reconnaissance planes had photographed massive Soviet buildups in the south. Thousands of tanks. Hundreds of artillery pieces. Radio chatter buzzed constantly with preparation orders, supply requests, and movement coordinates. Everything pointed south. Everything screamed Ukraine. So Hitler did exactly what the Soviets wanted him to do. He sent his reserves south. Every spare division, every reinforcement, every tank regiment went to Ukraine. The northern front was stripped of reserves. In Minsk, the German headquarters, officers attended the opera. They hosted dinner parties. One colonel wrote to his wife with barely concealed satisfaction. "The Russians are finished. We see them massing in the south, but they're too weak to attack us here." But here was the problem with German certainty. It was built on a lie they didn't even know they'd been told. Right then, concealed in the Belarusian forests, 1.7 million Soviet soldiers were waiting. They were positioned less than 30 miles from German lines. Completely invisible. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky commanded them in the north. Marshal Georgy Zhukov coordinated the entire operation from Moscow. Together they had been assembling this force for 3 months in total secrecy. How do you hide 2.4 million soldiers, 5,200 tanks, and 70,000 vehicles from German reconnaissance planes? From aerial photography? From experienced reconnaissance units that have been fighting for 3 years? The Soviets had spent 3 years perfecting the answer. They called it maskirovka, the art of military deception. The practice went far beyond simple camouflage. Every single night, Soviet tanks moved forward through the darkness. Before dawn broke, before German reconnaissance planes took to the skies, Soviet soldiers swept away every single track using pine branches. They moved methodically, erasing evidence as they advanced. Colonel General Sergei Shtimenko personally checked these operations. One misplaced track. One exposed mark. One visible sign could expose everything. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, where the Germans expected the actual attack, Soviet engineers constructed an entire fake army. 85,000 dummy vehicles. Inflatable tanks that looked completely real from 5,000 feet. Wooden artillery pieces positioned perfectly. Fake fuel dumps constructed from painted barrels. They even created phantom headquarters with radio operators transmitting fake orders and codes they knew the Germans had broken. Send more ammunition to Sector 12. Tank Battalion 45 needs fuel. Was beautiful, carefully crafted lies. German intelligence wrote it all down. They meticulously recorded every transmission, every sighting, every piece of evidence. Meanwhile, the real Soviet forces maintained total radio silence. Not a single transmission. Not one word. The discipline required to control millions of soldiers without radio communication was extraordinary, but it was absolute. Behind German lines, partisan fighters like Cheddar Kovac cut German telephone wires. They severed communication networks. They reported every German position, every defensive arrangement, every bunker location back to Moscow. But when the Soviet attack came, Germans wouldn't be able to call for help. The phones wouldn't work. The lines were dead. Soviet soldiers in those forests couldn't even write letters home. One private named Mikhail Frolov would later remember this period with haunting clarity. For 2 months, my mother thought I was dead. We couldn't send any word. We just waited in the forests invisible. Waiting for the signal. The psychological cost was immense. Millions of men sitting in forests, maintaining absolute silence, knowing an enormous operation was about to be launched. Knowing they were part of something massive. But unable to communicate. Unable to move. Unable to do anything except wait and prepare and maintain the deception. German reconnaissance planes took thousands of photographs over those 3 months. They showed massive Soviet forces in Ukraine. Empty forests in Belarus. Perfect. Exactly what the Soviets wanted them to see. A German intelligence officer, captured after the war, would later admit with bitter recognition, "We photographed exactly what they wanted us to see. We were blind, deaf, and dumb." The Soviets had created a perfect intelligence trap. They had shown the Germans exactly what they wanted to see. They had told them exactly what they wanted to hear. And German intelligence, confident in their methods and their analysis, had believed it all. On June 22, exactly 3 years to the day after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, Soviet reconnaissance units began probing German lines. Just small attacks. Nothing serious. Nothing that suggested what was coming. German commanders actually laughed. They called it symbolic harassment. They were wrong. It was the opening move of the greatest deception operation in military history. June 23, 1944. 4 in the morning. The forest exploded. What happened in those first seconds would reshape the entire Eastern Front. 170 Soviet divisions attacked simultaneously across 450 miles of front. The attack came not in Ukraine where it was expected. It came in Belarus, exactly where German intelligence had assured their commanders the Soviets were too weak to attack. The artillery barrage was apocalyptic in scale. Soviet guns opened up with such intensity that German soldiers positioned 20 meters behind the front lines literally couldn't hear each other scream. The noise was beyond comprehension. Beyond experience. It was a wall of sound that preceded a wall of metal and fire. Soviet tank columns didn't waste time trying to break through at specific points. They didn't follow the predictable patterns of previous Soviet offensives. Instead, they flowed forward like water finding paths around obstacles. When they encountered German strong points, German defensive positions, fortified locations, they simply flowed around them like water around rocks. They bypassed resistance, penetrated deep, and left encirclement for the infantry to clean up. Within hours, entire German divisions found themselves cut off. Surrounded. Trapped. Commanders began receiving reports of Soviet tanks behind them. Soviet tanks beside them. Soviet tanks in their supply areas. The careful German defensive lines that had been so secure just hours before were disintegrating into chaos. Field Marshal Busch grabbed his telephone. He called Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. His message was urgent, precise. "We need permission to retreat now. If we don't pull back immediately, we will lose the entire army group." Hitler's response was one word: no. Then came the explanation, delivered with absolute conviction: "Mein Führer. We'll lose the entire army group. Every fortress city must hold. Not one step back." Those words, "not one step back," would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. By noon on June 23, Soviet tanks had penetrated 20 miles into German territory. By nightfall, 35 miles. The German 3rd Panzer Army, elite tank units with decades of combat experience, found themselves encircled at Vitebsk. General Friedrich Gallwitzer commanded 35,000 men at that location. Within 48 hours, only 8,000 remained alive. The Luftwaffe scrambled desperately to provide air support. But Soviet fighters ruled the skies absolutely. 6,000 Soviet aircraft against 40 operational German fighters. The numbers tell the story completely. German pilot Hans Rudel wrote in his diary, "We took off with 12 planes. 3 came back." Marshal Rokossovsky's tanks reached speeds that confounded German understanding of what was possible. 50 miles in 3 days. Faster than the Germans themselves had moved during their invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. German officers began radioing desperately, "They're everywhere. Behind us. Beside us. How did they get here so fast?" The Soviet breakthrough wasn't a single penetration followed by fighting. It was a cascade of breakthroughs across the entire front, each one expanding, linking up, creating larger and larger encirclements. The Germans had been taught to think in terms of individual battles, individual defensive lines. But what was happening was something far more catastrophic: the systematic destruction of an entire army group through coordinated multi-front breakthrough. Private Wilhelm Hoffmann of the 267th Infantry Division kept a diary. His entry for June 25 captures the growing panic. Russians appeared from nowhere. Captain Miller shot himself rather than surrender. "We're running west. Those who can't run are left behind." The demoralization spread like a contagion. Soldiers who had been confident, who had been eating well, who had been hosting opera performances in divisional headquarters just days before, were now running. They were abandoning equipment. They were throwing away ammunition. They were focused on one thing only: survival. At Babrisk, 70,000 German soldiers found themselves in a closing trap. The Soviet encirclement was tightening like a noose. General Jordan commanded these forces. He sent a desperate message to Hitler: permission to break out, to fight westward through the Soviet lines while there was still a chance, while supplies hadn't completely run out, while the encirclement wasn't completely sealed. Hitler's response came back within hours: "Babrisk is a fortress. Fortresses don't retreat." The Führer stared at his maps in East Prussia. He visualized his fortress cities as immovable rocks that would break the Soviet wave, that would hold indefinitely, that would become legendary names in German military history. He was catastrophically wrong. They would become tombs. At Babrisk, Soviet artillery turned the city into hell. One German soldier, Private Heinz K., wrote his last letter home. The words are haunting in their simplicity and desperation. "The entire city burns. Russians shell us every minute. We have no food, no medical supplies. The wounded scream all night. Command says, 'Hold.' Hold what? There's nothing left." General Jordan faced an impossible decision. He could obey Hitler's orders to hold Babrisk forever. That meant his men would be slaughtered. Or he could disobey, commit an act of insubordination that could mean his own execution if he survived. On June 27 he made his choice. He ordered a breakout. 35,000 men attempted to escape the Babrisk pocket. They broke through Soviet lines and tried to fight westward through the open countryside. Soviet tanks and aircraft hunted them in the open fields. The massacre was systematic. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were captured. When the pocket finally collapsed, only 15,000 made it out alive. 20,000 men were simply gone, killed, captured, or missing. Soviet forces filmed the aftermath. Mountains of German corpses. Burned-out tanks. Equipment scattered across the devastated landscape. One Soviet cameraman wrote, "I filmed 3 years of war. I've never seen destruction like this." The fortress cities fell in rapid succession. Vitebsk on June 26, Orsha on June 27, Mogilev on June 28. Each fortress that Hitler had demanded must hold forever fell in days. The collapse accelerated with each passing day. The situation spiraled from bad to catastrophic to unimaginable. Then came the biggest prize. Minsk wasn't just another city. It was Army Group Center's main supply hub. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every bandage, every piece of ammunition, every bit of food, everything passed through Minsk. It was the logistical heart of the entire German position in Belarus. On July 3, just 11 days after the offensive began, Soviet tanks entered the city. The implications were immediate and total. 100,000 Germans were now trapped east of Minsk. They had no supplies, no fuel, no food, no hope. They were trapped between encircling Soviet forces with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever ammunition they carried. Field Marshal Busch flew to Hitler's headquarters. He was desperate. He begged. His exact words: "Let them retreat while there's still time. We can still save some of them. We can still form defensive lines further west. But if we don't move now, the entire army group will be destroyed." Hitler fired him on the spot. He couldn't tolerate dissent. He couldn't accept that his strategy was failing. He couldn't admit that his fortress doctrine was creating death traps instead of defensive strongholds. He brought in Field Marshal Model, known as the Führer's fireman, the general who could supposedly put out any fire, solve any crisis, salvage any deteriorating situation. But Model arrived to find a situation beyond salvaging. Army Group Center had lost 31 of its 47 generals. They were either dead or captured. The command structure was shattered. Model sent one message to Hitler, delivered with brutal honesty: the army group no longer exists as a fighting force. The message was simple. The implication was total defeat. In just 2 weeks, proud Wehrmacht divisions that had conquered France, Yugoslavia, and Greece were reduced to starving bands of survivors wandering through the Belarusian countryside. These were elite units, professional soldiers with years of combat experience, veterans of multiple campaigns. Now they were reduced to throwing away their weapons because carrying them was too exhausting. They were stripping dead Soviet soldiers for food. They were stumbling westward, trying to reach German lines that no longer existed, through territory that was entirely controlled by Soviet forces. The scale of the collapse was difficult for anyone to comprehend. In 5 weeks, Operation Bagration had destroyed Army Group Center completely. 450,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured. 31 divisions eliminated. The Wehrmacht had lost more men in 5 weeks in Belarus than it had lost in 5 months at Stalingrad, the most brutal battle of the war. Soviet forces had advanced 450 miles. They had liberated all of Belarus. They had reached Poland's borders. For the first time since 1941, since Hitler had launched Operation Barbarossa, Soviet soldiers stood on the edge of German territory. The eastern border of the Third Reich was now vulnerable. A captured German general, Friedrich Gallwitzer, told his interrogators after the war with a tone of grudging admiration mixed with humiliation, "We never imagined such deception was possible. You made us look exactly where you wanted. When we finally saw the truth, it was too late." Those words captured the essence of what had happened. The Germans hadn't been defeated by superior firepower alone. They had been defeated by superior deception. They had been defeated by an enemy that understood their thinking, understood their expectations, and manipulated those expectations with surgical precision. Stalin wanted the world to see what the Red Army had done. He wanted no ambiguity about who had won, about who controlled the narrative, about which power had demonstrated military mastery. So he organized something unprecedented. Something that would shock the world and signal a fundamental shift in global power. The fall of Minsk wasn't just a military defeat. It was the symbolic collapse of German authority in the East. For 3 years, the city had been the administrative center of German occupation. It had been where orders were issued, where supplies were distributed, where the German presence in Belarus was most concentrated. Now it was gone. The speed of the collapse demonstrated something that German high command couldn't ignore. The Red Army had fundamentally transformed. The force that had nearly collapsed completely in 1941, that had been on the verge of total defeat during the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, had evolved into something terrifying. The Soviet military had learned. It had adapted. It had grown. It had absorbed 3 years of brutal warfare and emerged stronger. The Red Army had taken German tactics, blitzkrieg, rapid breakthrough, encirclement, deep penetration, and they had improved upon them. They had combined these tactics with deception on a massive scale, with overwhelming force, with superior numbers of aircraft and tanks, with discipline in maintaining operational security. The result was an offensive that was faster, more coordinated, and more devastating than anything the Germans had witnessed. Minsk fell, and with it, the entire German defensive structure in Belarus collapsed. Army Group Center ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The remaining German soldiers weren't an army anymore. They were refugees. They were survivors. They were men trying to escape toward the west before Soviet forces could encircle them completely. The loss of Minsk also meant the loss of all supply lines. Every piece of equipment that had been stockpiled there was now in Soviet hands. Every fuel dump. Every ammunition depot. Every medical supply. Everything that a retreating army needs to maintain cohesion and fighting capability was gone. The Germans were forced to abandon wounded soldiers because there was no way to transport them. They were forced to destroy their own equipment because there was no way to move it westward. This wasn't the slow retreat of a defeated army. This was a catastrophic collapse. Units were separated from their parent commands. Officers lost contact with their soldiers. Entire regiments became mixed with fragments of other regiments. The professional structure of the Wehrmacht, built over decades, was being torn apart in real time. Soldiers who had maintained discipline, who had followed orders, who had believed in their cause, were now reduced to survival mode. The cohesion that had made the Wehrmacht such a formidable force was dissolving like sugar in water. Stalin wanted the world to see what the Red Army had done. He didn't want ambiguity. He didn't want any possibility of the West misunderstanding the magnitude of Soviet victory. So on July 17, 1944, Moscow witnessed something unprecedented in modern warfare. 57,000 German prisoners marched through the capital streets. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. These included 19 generals. Men who had commanded entire armies. Men who had been respected figures in their own countries. Now they shuffled through Moscow like ghosts. They walked 20 abreast down the main streets. The column took 90 minutes to pass. 90 minutes of continuous German prisoners. Soviet citizens lined the streets. Some spat. Some threw stones. Most just stared in silence. These were the invaders who had killed 27 million Soviet people. These were the men who had brought war to the Soviet homeland. These were the Germans who had committed atrocities, who had occupied Soviet cities, who had fought to enslave Soviet people. Journalist Vasily Eigman watched from Red Square. He observed the prisoners with clinical precision. They walked with their eyes down. No pride left, no hope, just endless gray columns of the defeated. After the prisoners passed, street cleaning trucks followed. They drove down the same streets the Germans had walked. The trucks sprayed water and disinfectant on the pavement. They were washing away the Nazi stain. The symbolism was unmissable and completely intentional. The German invasion was being erased. The Nazi occupation was being literally scrubbed from Soviet soil. The parade served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a demonstration of Soviet military power to the world. It was a message to the Western Allies that the Soviet Union had won decisive victories without their direct military participation on the Eastern Front. It was a propaganda statement, showing Soviet citizens that their sacrifices had been vindicated, that victory was possible, that the invaders could be defeated. But it was also something more personal. It was humiliation on a massive scale. It was revenge. It was the reversal of every defeat, every retreat, every moment when Soviet soldiers had been forced to run westward by German tanks. Now German generals walked through Moscow as prisoners. Now the conquerors had become the conquered. The parade sent shockwaves through the Western world. In London and Washington, military strategists studied the implications. The Soviets had demonstrated capability. They had demonstrated coordination. They had demonstrated the ability to destroy entire German army groups. The implications for the post-war order were staggering. The numbers were staggering. In 5 weeks, Operation Bagration had destroyed Army Group Center completely. 450,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured. 31 divisions eliminated from the German order of battle. The Wehrmacht had lost more combat power in Belarus in 5 weeks than it had lost at Stalingrad in 5 months. Soviet forces had advanced 450 miles eastward. They had liberated all of Belarus. They had cleared German forces from territory that had been occupied for 3 years. They had reached the borders of Poland. For the first time since 1941, Soviet soldiers were positioned to invade German territory. The strategic implications were total. Germany could no longer defend the Eastern Front with the same forces that had held it for 3 years. The Wehrmacht had been fundamentally weakened. Replacements would be difficult to find. Experienced officers had been killed or captured. The remaining units were demoralized, exhausted, and without the equipment they had lost. Yet today, every schoolchild in the West learns about D-Day. The Normandy landings are taught as the turning point of World War II in Europe. Countless books have been written about Operation Overlord. Movies have been made. Documentaries have been produced. D-Day is legendary. D-Day is remembered. But Operation Bagration remains largely forgotten in the West. Historical eclipsed. Overshadowed. Lost in the popular imagination. Perhaps because it reminds us of something uncomfortable. Perhaps because it suggests that the war's outcome might not have been decided on the beaches of Normandy, but rather in the forests of Belarus, where a massive German army group was systematically destroyed through deception and overwhelming force. The truth is that World War II was won on multiple fronts simultaneously. D-Day was strategically important. It established a Western presence in Europe. It forced Germany to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. But it didn't destroy German military capability in the way that Operation Bagration destroyed it. Bagration eliminated an entire German army group, 400,000 soldiers gone in 5 weeks. That level of destruction was unparalleled. Yet Western history has consistently minimized Soviet contributions to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Operation Bagration is just one example. The Soviets suffered the most casualties. The Soviets fought the largest battles. The Soviets did the most to destroy German military power. And yet their victories are often reduced to footnotes in Western historical narratives. But Operation Bagration wasn't just a demonstration of overwhelming force. It was a demonstration of military genius. It was a masterclass in deception. It was a proof that intelligence, planning, and psychological manipulation could amplify military power in ways that brute force alone could not. The Red Army had transformed. The force that had nearly collapsed in 1941 was now unstoppable. They had taken German tactics against the Germans. They had understood blitzkrieg. They had understood encirclement. They had understood deep penetration. But they had improved upon these tactics. They had added deception on a massive scale. They had maintained operational security. They had used false information to guide German decisions. Maskirovka, military deception, wasn't a Soviet invention. But the Soviets had perfected it in ways that no military power had achieved before. They had coordinated deception across an entire front. They had maintained the deception against sophisticated German reconnaissance. They had used broken German codes against the Germans, transmitting false information in codes they knew would be intercepted and decrypted. The result was that German high command made decisions based on false information. They positioned reserves based on false threats. They failed to prepare for an attack because they had been convinced the attack would come elsewhere. They were completely blindsided by something that should have been obvious but was hidden through brilliant deception. Military theorists studied this operation for decades afterward. They analyzed what the Soviets had done. They tried to understand how 1.7 million soldiers could be hidden, how 5,200 tanks could be concealed, how the entire focus of German intelligence could be misdirected. The answers revealed truths about warfare that were applicable to all future conflicts. Deception isn't supplementary to military force. It's central to military success. An enemy that can be deceived is an enemy that makes mistakes. An enemy that makes mistakes is an enemy that can be defeated. The Soviets understood this in 1944. They demonstrated it with absolute clarity at Operation Bagration. Entire German army group vanished because they looked exactly where Stalin wanted them to look. The Führer had stared at his maps. He had seen what he expected to see. He had believed what his intelligence officers told him. He had made decisions based on that belief. And every decision had been exactly what Stalin wanted him to do. It was a perfect trap. Not because it was complicated, but because it was elegant. Because it manipulated the expectations of German commanders. Because it used their own intelligence gathering against them. Because it fed them information they wanted to believe, that the main attack would come in Ukraine, that Belarus was secure, that they could relax their vigilance. And when the trap closed, it closed with devastating finality. 500,000 men ceased to exist in 23 days. They were killed. They were captured. They were scattered. They were lost. The implications extended far beyond Belarus. Operation Bagration demonstrated that the outcome of World War II might not have been decided on Normandy's beaches, despite what Western history would suggest. It suggested that the war's outcome was decided in the forests of Belarus, where Soviet mastery of deception and overwhelming force created a catastrophe so complete that it couldn't be recovered from. The Germans went to bed confident. They woke up to annihilation. In 23 days, 500,000 men ceased to exist. All because they looked exactly where Stalin wanted them to look. All because they believed exactly what the Soviets wanted them to believe. All because they made decisions based on a reality that the Soviets had carefully constructed for them. This is what happens when deception combines with military power. This is what happens when an enemy understands your thinking and turns it against you. This is what happens when a military force is willing to maintain discipline, security, and coordination across millions of soldiers for months to achieve strategic surprise. Operation Bagration was the greatest magic trick in military history. The Germans were the audience. And they watched in horror as their army vanished before their eyes.